B. As knowledge increases, the attitude of science towards the things of the invisible world is undergoing considerable modification. Its attention is no longer directed solely to the earth with all its variety of objects, or to the physical worlds around it, but it finds itself compelled to glance further afield, and to construct hypotheses as to the nature of the matter and force which lie in the regions beyond the ken of its instruments. Ether is now comfortably settled in the scientific kingdom, becoming almost more than a hypothesis. Mesmerism, under its new name of hypnotism, is no longer an outcast. Reichenbach's experiments are still looked at askance, but are not wholly condemned. Röntgen's rays have rearranged some of the older ideas of matter, while radium has revolutionized them, and is leading science beyond the borderland of ether into the astral world. The boundaries between animate and inanimate matter are broken down. Magnets are found to be possessed of almost uncanny powers, transferring certain forms of disease in a way not yet satisfactorily explained. Telepathy, clairvoyance, movement without contact, though not yet admitted to the scientific table, are approaching the Cinderella stage. The fact is that science has pressed its researches so far, has used such rare ingenuity in its questionings of nature, has shown such tireless patience in its investigations, that it is receiving the reward of those who seek, and forces and beings of the next higher plane of nature are beginning to show themselves on the outer edge of the physical field. Nature makes no leaps, and as the physicist nears the confines of his kingdom, he finds himself bewildered by touches and gleams from another realm which interpenetrates his own. He finds himself compelled to speculate on invisible presences, if only to find a rational explanation for undoubted physical phenomena, and insensibly he slips over the boundary, and is, although he does not yet realize it, contacting the astral plane. One of the most interesting of the highroads from the physical to the astral is that of the study of thought. The Western scientist, commencing in the anatomy and physiology of the brain, endeavors to make these the basis for a sound psychology. He passes then into the region of dreams, illusions, hallucinations, and as soon as he endeavors to elaborate an experimental science which shall classify and arrange these, he inevitably plunges into the astral plane. Dr. Baraduc of Paris has nearly crossed the barrier, and is well on the way towards photographing astromental images, to obtaining pictures of what from the materialistic standpoint would be the results of vibrations in the gray matter of the brain. It has long been known to those who have given attention to the question that impressions were produced by the reflection of the ultraviolet rays from objects not visible by the rays of the ordinary spectrum. Clairvoyants were occasionally justified by the appearance on sensitive photographic plates of figures seen and described by them as present with the sitter, though invisible to physical sight. It is not possible for an unbiased judgment to reject in toto the evidence of such occurrences proffered by men of integrity on the strength of their own experiments, oftentimes repeated. And now we have investigators who turn their attention to the obtaining of images of subtle forms, inventing methods specially designed with the view of reproducing them. Among these, Dr. Baraduc seems to have been the most successful, and he has published a volume dealing with his investigations and containing reproductions of the photographs he has obtained. Dr. Baraduc states that he is investigating the subtle forces by which the soul, defined as the intelligence working between the body and the spirit, expresses itself, by seeking to record its movements by means of a needle, its luminous but invisible vibrations by impressions on sensitive plates. He shuts out by non-conductors electricity and heat. We can pass over his experiments in biometry, measurement 4. Of life by movements, and glance at those in iconography, the impressions of invisible waves, regarded by him as of the nature of light, in which the soul draws its own image. A number of these photographs represent etheric and magnetic results of physical phenomena, and these again we may pass over as not bearing on our special subject, interesting as they are in themselves. Dr. Baraduc obtained various impressions by strongly thinking of an object, the effect produced by the thought form appearing on a sensitive plate. Thus he tried to project a portrait of a lady, then dead, whom he had known, and produced an impression due to his thought of a drawing he had made of her on her deathbed. He quite rightly says that the creation of an object is the passing out of an image from the mind and its subsequent materialization, and he seeks the chemical effect caused on silver salts by this thought created. Picture. One striking illustration is that of a force raying outwards, the projection of an earnest prayer. Another prayer is seen producing forms like the fronds of a fern, another like rain pouring upwards, if the phrase may be permitted. A rippled oblong mass is projected by three persons thinking of their unity in affection. A young boy sorrowing over and caressing a dead bird is surrounded by a flood of curved interwoven threads of emotional disturbance. A strong vortex is formed by a feeling of deep sadness. Looking at this most interesting and suggestive series, it is clear that in these pictures that which is obtained is not the thought image, but the effect caused in etheric matter by its vibrations, and it is necessary to clairvoyantly see the thought in order to understand the results produced. In fact, the illustrations are instructive for what they do not show directly, as well as for the images that appear. At the present time, observers outside the Theosophical Society are concerning themselves with the fact that emotional changes show their nature by changes of color in the cloud-like ovoid, or aura, that encompasses all living beings. Articles on the subject are appearing in papers unconnected with the Theosophical Society, and a medical specialist 0F1 has collected a large number of cases in which the color O. 1 Dr. Hooker, Gloucester Place, London, W. 5. We have often heard it said that thoughts are things, and there are many among us who are persuaded of the truth of this statement. Yet very few of us have any clear idea as to what kind of thing a thought is, and the object of this little book is to help us to conceive this. There are some serious difficulties in our way, for our conception of space is limited to 3 dimensions, and when we attempt to make a drawing we practically limit ourselves to 2. In reality, the presentation even of ordinary 3-dimensional objects is seriously defective, for scarcely a line or angle in our drawing is accurately shown. If a road crosses the picture, the part in the foreground must be represented as enormously wider than that in the background, although in reality the width is unchanged. If a house is to be drawn, the right angles at its corners must be shown as acute or obtuse as the case may be, but hardly ever as they actually are. In fact, we draw everything not as it is but as it appears, and the effort of the artist is by a skillful arrangement of lines upon a flat surface to convey to the eye an impression which shall recall that made by a 3-dimensional object. It is possible to do this only because similar objects are already familiar to those who look at the picture and accept the suggestion which it conveys. A person who had never seen a tree could form but little idea of one from even the most skillful painting. If to this difficulty we add the other and far more serious one of a limitation of consciousness, and suppose ourselves to be showing the picture to a being who knew only 2 dimensions, we see how utterly impossible it would be to convey to him any adequate impression of such a landscape as we see. Precisely this difficulty in its most aggravated form stands in our way when we try to make a drawing of even a very simple thought form. The vast majority of those who look at the picture are absolutely limited to the consciousness of 3 dimensions, and furthermore, have not the slightest conception of that inner world to which thought forms belong, with all its splendid light and color. All that we can do at the best is to represent a section of the thought form, and those whose faculties enable them to see the original cannot but be disappointed with any reproduction of it. Still, those who are at present unable to see anything will gain at least a partial comprehension, and however inadequate it may be, it is at least better than nothing. All students know that what is called the aura of man is the outer part of the cloud-like substance of his higher bodies, interpenetrating each other, and extending beyond the confines of his physical body, the smallest of all. They know also that 2 of these bodies, the mental and desire bodies, are those chiefly concerned with the appearance of what are called thought forms. But in order that the matter may be made clear for all, and not only for students already acquainted with theosophical teachings, a recapitulation of the main facts will not be out of place. Man, the thinker, is clothed in a body composed of innumerable combinations of the subtle matter of the mental plane, this body being more or less refined in its constituents and organized more or less fully for its functions, according to the stage of intellectual development at which the man himself has arrived. The mental body is an object of great beauty, the delicacy and rapid motion of its particles giving it an aspect of living iridescent light, and this beauty becomes an extraordinarily radiant and entrancing loveliness as the intellect becomes more highly evolved and is employed chiefly on pure and sublime topics. Every thought gives rise to a set of correlated vibrations in the matter of this body, accompanied with a marvelous play of color, like that in the spray of a waterfall as the 6. 7. Each definite thought produces a double effect, a radiating vibration and a floating form. The thought itself appears first to clairvoyant sight as a vibration in the mental body, and this may be either simple or complex. If the thought itself is absolutely simple, there is only the one rate of vibration, and only one type of mental matter will be strongly affected. The mental body is composed of matter of several degrees of density, which we commonly arrange in classes according to the subplanes. Of each of these we have many subdivisions, and if we typify these by drawing horizontal lines to indicate the different degrees of density, there is another arrangement which we might symbolize by drawing perpendicular lines at right angles to the others, to denote types which differ in quality as well as in density. There are thus many varieties of this mental matter, and it is found that each one of these has its own especial and appropriate rate of vibration, to which it seems most accustomed, so that it very readily responds to it, and tends to return to it as soon as possible when it has been forced away from it by some strong rush of thought or feeling. When a sudden wave of some emotion sweeps over a man, for example, his astral body is thrown into violent agitation, and its original colors are or the time almost obscured by the flush of carmine, of blue, or of scarlet which corresponds with the rate of vibration of that particular emotion. This change is only temporary, it passes off in a few seconds, and the astral body rapidly resumes its usual condition. Yet every such rush of feeling produces a permanent effect, it always adds a little of its hue to the normal coloring of the astral body, so that every time that the man yields himself to a certain emotion it becomes easier for him to yield himself to it again, because his astral body is getting into the habit of vibrating at that especial rate. The majority of human thoughts, however, are by no means simple. Absolutely pure affection of course exists, but we very often find it tinged with pride or with selfishness, with jealousy or with animal passion. This means that at least two separate vibrations appear both in the mental and astral bodies, frequently more than two. The radiating vibration, therefore, will be a complex one, and the resultant thought form will show several colors instead of only one. 8. How the vibration acts. These radiating vibrations, like all others in nature, become less powerful in proportion to the distance from their source, though it is probable that the variation is in proportion to the cube of the distance instead of to the square, because of the additional dimension involved. Again, like all other vibrations, these tend to reproduce themselves whenever opportunity is offered to them, and so whenever they strike upon another mental body they tend to provoke in it their own rate of motion. That is, from the point of view of the man whose mental body is touched by these waves, they tend to produce in his mind thoughts of the same type as that which had previously arisen in the mind of the thinker who sent forth the waves. The distance to which such thought waves penetrate, and the force and persistency with which they impinge upon the mental bodies of others, depend upon the strength and clearness of the original thought. In this way the thinker is in the same position as the speaker. The voice of the latter sets in motion waves of sound in the air which radiate from him in all directions, and convey his message to all those who are within hearing, and the distance to which his voice can penetrate depends upon its power and upon the clearness of his enunciation. In just the same way the forceful thought will carry very much further than the weak and undecided thought, but clearness and definiteness are of even greater importance than strength. Again, just as the speaker's voice may fall upon heedless ears where men are already engaged in business or in pleasure, so may a mighty wave of thought sweep past without affecting the mind of the man, if he be already deeply engrossed in some other line of thought. It should be understood that this radiating vibration conveys the character of the thought, but not its subject. If a Hindu sits wrapped in devotion to Kiha, the waves of feeling which pour forth from him stimulate devotional feeling in all those who come under their influence, though in the case of the Mohammedan that devotion is to Allah, while for the Zoroastrian it is to Ahura Mazda, or for the Christian to Jesus. A man thinking keenly upon some high subject pours out from himself vibrations which tend to stir up thought at a similar level in others, but they in no way suggest to those others the special subject of his thought. They naturally act with special vigor upon those minds already habituated to vibrations of similar character, yet they have some effect on every mental body upon which they impinge, so that their tendency is to awaken the power of higher thought in those to whom it has not yet become accustomed. It is thus evident that every man who thinks along high lines is doing missionary work, even though he may be entirely unconscious of it. 9. Let us turn now to the second effect of thought, the creation of a definite form. All students of the occult are acquainted with the idea of the elemental essence, that strange half-intelligent life which surrounds us in all directions, vivifying the matter of the mental and astral planes. This matter thus animated responds very readily to the influence of human thought, and every impulse sent out either from the mental body or from the astral body of man, immediately clothes itself in a temporary vehicle of this vitalist matter. Such a thought or impulse becomes for the time a kind of living creature, the thought force being the soul, and the vivified matter the body. Instead of using the somewhat clumsy paraphrase, astral or mental matter ensouled by the monadic essence at the stage of one of the elemental kingdoms, theosophical writers often, for brevity's sake, call this quickened matter simply elemental essence, and sometimes they speak of the thought form as an elemental. There may be infinite variety in the color and shape of such elementals or thought forms, for each thought draws round it the matter which is appropriate for its expression, and sets that matter into vibration in harmony with its own, so that the character of the thought decides its color, and the study of its variations and combinations is an exceedingly interesting one. This thought form may not inaptly be compared to a Leyden jar, the coating of living essence being symbolized by the jar, and the thought energy by the charge of electricity. If the man's thought or feeling is directly connected with someone else, the resultant thought form moves towards that person and discharges itself upon his astral and mental bodies. If the man's thought is about himself, or is based upon a personal feeling, as the vast majority of thoughts are, it hovers round its creator and is always ready to react upon him whenever he is for a moment in a passive condition. For example, a man who yields himself to thoughts of impurity may forget all about them while he is engaged in the daily routine of his business, even though the resultant forms are hanging round him in a heavy cloud, because his attention is otherwise directed and his astral body is therefore not impressible by any other rate of vibration than its own. When, however, the marked vibration slackens and the man rests after his labors and leaves his mind blank as regards definite thought, he is very likely to feel the vibration of impurity stealing insidiously upon him. If the consciousness of the man be to any extent awakened, he may perceive this and cry out that he is being tempted by the devil, yet the truth is that the temptation is from without only in appearance, since it is nothing but the natural reaction upon him of his own thought forms. Each man travels through space enclosed within a cage of his own building, surrounded by a mass of the forms created by his habitual thoughts. Through this medium he looks out upon the world, and naturally he sees everything tinged with its predominant colors, and all rates of vibration which reach him from without are more or less modified by its rate. Thus, until the man learns complete control of thought and feeling, he sees nothing as it really is, since all his observations must be made through this medium, which distorts and colors everything like badly made glass. If the thought form be neither definitely personal nor specially aimed at someone else, it simply floats detached in the atmosphere, all the time radiating vibrations similar to those originally sent forth by its creator. If it does not come into contact with any other mental body, this radiation gradually exhausts its store of energy, and in that case the form falls to pieces. But if it succeeds in awakening sympathetic vibration in any mental body near at hand, an attraction is set up, and the thought form is usually absorbed by that mental body. Thus we see that the influence of the thought form is by no means so far-reaching as that of 10. The fact of the creation by vibrations of a distinct form, geometrical or other, is already familiar to every student of acoustics, and Chladni's figures are continually reproduced in every physical laboratory. Figure 1. Chladni's sound plate. For the lay reader, the following brief description may be useful. A Chladni's sound plate, Figure 1, is made of brass or plate glass. Grains of fine sand or spores are scattered over the surface, and the edge of the plate is bowed. The sand is thrown up into the air by the vibration of the plate, and re-falling on the plate is arranged in regular lines, Figure 2. By touching the edge of the plate at different points when it is bowed, different notes, and hence varying forms, are obtained, Figure 3. If the figures here given are compared with those obtained from the human voice, many likenesses will be observed. For these latter, the voice forms so admirably studied and pictured by Mrs. Watts Hughes, 1F2 bearing witness to the same fact, should be consulted, and her work on the subject should be in the hands of every student. But few perhaps have realized that the shapes pictured are due to the interplay of the vibrations that 2. 11. Create them, and that a machine exists by means of which two or more simultaneous motions can be imparted to a pendulum, and that by attaching a fine drawing pen to a lever connected with the pendulum its action may be exactly traced. Substitute for the swing of the pendulum the vibrations set up in the mental or astral body, and we have clearly before us the modus operandi of the building of forms by vibrations. 2F3. 3. Mr. Joseph Gould, Stratford House, Nottingham, supplies the twin elliptic pendulum by which these wonderful figures may be produced. 12. 13. 14. The table of colors given in the frontispiece has already been thoroughly described in the book Man Visible and Invisible, and the meaning to be attached to them is just the same in the thought form as in the body out of which it is evolved. For the sake of those who have not at hand the full description given in the book just mentioned, it will be well to state that black means hatred and malice. Red, of all shades from lurid brick red to brilliant scarlet, indicates anger. Brutal anger will show as flashes of lurid red from dark brown clouds, while the anger of noble indignation is a vivid scarlet, by no means unbeautiful, though it gives an unpleasant thrill. A particularly dark and unpleasant red, almost exactly the color called dragon's blood, shows animal passion and sensual desire of various kinds. Clear brown, almost burnt sienna, shows avarice. Hard dull brown gray is a sign of selfishness, a color which is indeed painfully common. Deep heavy gray signifies depression, while a livid pale gray is associated with fear. Gray-green is a signal of deceit, while brownish-green, usually flecked with points and flashes of scarlet, betokens jealousy. Green seems always to denote adaptability. In the lowest case, when mingled with selfishness, this adaptability becomes deceit. At a later stage, when the color becomes purer, it means rather the wish to be all things to all men, even though it may be chiefly for the sake of becoming popular and bearing a good reputation with them. In its still higher, more delicate and more luminous aspect, it shows the divine power of sympathy. Affection expresses itself in all shades of crimson and rose. A full clear carmine means a strong healthy affection of normal type. If stained heavily with brown-gray, a selfish and grasping feeling is indicated, while pure pale rose marks that absolutely unselfish love which is possible only to high natures. It passes from the dull crimson of animal love to the most exquisite shades of delicate rose, like the early flushes of the dawning, as the love becomes purified from all selfish elements, and flows out in wider and wider circles of generous impersonal tenderness and compassion to all who are in need. With a touch of the blue of devotion in it, this may express a strong realization of the universal brotherhood of humanity. Deep orange imports pride or ambition, and the various shades of yellow denote intellect or intellectual gratification, dull yellow ochre implying the direction of such faculty to selfish purposes, while clear gamboge shows a distinctly higher type, and pale luminous primrose yellow is a sign of the highest and most unselfish use of intellectual power, the pure reason directed to spiritual ends. The different shades of blue all indicate religious feeling, and range through all hues from the dark brown blue of selfish devotion, or the pallid gray blue of fetish worship tinged with fear, up to the rich deep clear color of heartfelt adoration, and the beautiful pale azure of that highest form which implies self-renunciation and union with the divine. The devotional thought of an unselfish heart is very lovely in color, like the deep blue of a summer sky. Through such clouds of blue will often shine out golden stars of great brilliancy, darting upwards like a shower of sparks. A mixture of affection and devotion is manifested by a tint of violet, and the more delicate shades of this invariably show the capacity of absorbing and responding to a high and beautiful ideal. The brilliancy and the depth of the colors are usually a measure of the strength and the activity of the feeling. Another consideration which must not be forgotten is the type of matter in which these forms are generated. If a thought be purely intellectual and impersonal, for example, if the thinker is attempting to solve a problem in algebra or geometry, the thought form and the wave of vibration will be confined entirely to the mental plane. If, however, the thought be of a spiritual nature, if it be tinged with love and aspiration or deep unselfish feeling, it will rise upwards from the mental plane and will borrow much of the splendor and glory of the 15. Buddhic level. In such a case its influence is exceedingly powerful, and every such thought is a mighty force for good which cannot but produce a decided effect upon all mental bodies within reach, if they contain any quality at all capable of response. If, on the other hand, the thought has in it something of self or of personal desire, at once its vibration turns downwards, and it draws round itself a body of astral matter in addition to its clothing of mental matter. Such a thought form is capable of acting upon the astral bodies of other men as well as their minds, so that it can not only raise thought within them, but can also stir up their feelings. 16. From the point of view of the forms which they produce, we may group thought into three classes. 1. That which takes the image of the thinker. When a man thinks of himself as in some distant place, or wishes earnestly to be in that place, he makes a thought form in his own image which appears there. Such a form has not infrequently been seen by others, and has sometimes been taken for the astral body or apparition of the man himself. In such a case, either the seer must have enough of clairvoyance for the time to be able to observe that astral shape, or the thought form must have sufficient strength to materialize itself, that is, to draw round itself temporarily a certain amount of physical matter. The thought which generates such a form as this must necessarily be a strong one, and it therefore employs a larger proportion of the matter of the mental body, so that though the form is small and compressed when it leaves the thinker, it draws round it a considerable amount of astral matter, and usually expands to life size before it appears at its destination. 2. That which takes the image of some material object. When a man thinks of his friend, he forms within his mental body a minute image of that friend, which often passes outward and usually floats suspended in the air before him. In the same way, if he thinks of a room, a house, a landscape, tiny images of these things are formed within the mental body and afterwards externalized. This is equally true when he is exercising his imagination. The painter who forms a conception of his future picture builds it up out of the matter of his mental body, and then projects it into space in front of him, keeps it before his mind's eye, and copies it. The novelist in the same way builds images of his character in mental matter, and by the exercise of his will moves these puppets from one position or grouping to another, so that the plot of his story is literally acted out before him. With our curiously inverted conceptions of reality, it is hard for us to understand that these mental images actually exist, and are so entirely objective that they may readily be seen by the clairvoyant, and can even be rearranged by someone other than their creator. Some novelists have been dimly aware of such a process, and have testified that their characters when once created developed a will of their own, and insisted on carrying the plot of the story along lines quite different from those originally intended by the author. This has actually happened, sometimes because the thought forms were ensouled by playful nature spirits, or more often because some dead novelist, watching on the astral plane the development of the plan of his fellow author, thought that he could improve upon it, and chose this method of putting forward his suggestions. 3. That which takes a form entirely its own, expressing its inherent qualities in the matter which it draws round it. Only thought forms of this third class can usefully be illustrated, for to represent those of the first or second class would be merely to draw portraits or landscapes. In those types we have the plastic mental or astral matter molded in imitation of forms belonging to the physical plane. In this third group we have a glimpse of the forms natural to the astral or mental planes. Yet this very fact, which makes them so interesting, places an insuperable barrier in the way of their accurate reproduction. Thought forms of this third class almost invariably manifest themselves upon the astral plane, as the vast majority of them are expressions of feeling as well as of thought. Those of which we here give specimens are almost wholly of that class, except that we take a few examples. 17. 18. Vague pure affection. Figure 8 is a revolving cloud of pure affection, and except for its vagueness it represents a very good feeling. The person from whom it emanates is happy and at peace with the world, thinking dreamily of some friend whose very presence is a pleasure. There is nothing keen or strong about the feeling, yet it is one of gentle well-being, and of an unselfish delight in the proximity of those who are beloved. The feeling which gives birth to such a cloud is pure of its kind, but there is in it no force capable of producing definite results. An appearance by no means unlike this frequently surrounds a gently purring cat, and radiates slowly outward from the animal in a series of gradually enlarging concentric shells of rosy cloud, fading into invisibility at a distance of a few feet from their drowsily contented creator. Figure 8. Vague pure affection. Vague selfish affection. Figure 9 shows us also a cloud of affection, but this time it is deeply tinged with a far less desirable feeling. The dull hard brown-gray of selfishness shows itself very decidedly among the carmine of love, and thus we see that the affection which is indicated is closely connected with satisfaction at favors already received, and with a lively anticipation of others to come in the near future. Indefinite as was the feeling which produced the cloud in Figure 8, it was at least free from this taint of selfishness, and it therefore showed a certain nobility of nature in its author. Figure 9 represents what takes the place of that condition. 19. 20. 21. 22. 23. Vague religious feeling. Figure 14 shows us another shapeless rolling cloud, but this time it is blue instead of crimson. It betokens that vaguely pleasurable religious feeling, a sensation of devoutness rather than of devotion, which is so common among those in whom piety is more developed than intellect. In many a church one may see a great cloud of deep dull blue floating over the heads of the congregation, indefinite in outline, because of the indistinct nature of the thoughts and feelings which cause it, flecked too often with brown and gray, because ignorant devotion absorbs with deplorable facility the dismal tincture of selfishness or fear, but none the less adumbrating a mighty potentiality of the future, manifesting to our eyes the first faint flutter of one at least of the twin wings of devotion and wisdom, by the use of which the soul flies upward to God from whom it came. Figure 14. Vague religious feeling. 24. 25. 26. 27. This form is of the loveliest pale azure, with a glory of white light shining through it, something indeed to tax the skill even of the indefatigable artist who worked so hard to get them as nearly right as possible. It is what a Catholic would call a definite act of devotion, better still, an act of utter selflessness, of self-surrender and renunciation. 28. Vague intellectual pleasure. Figure 18 represents a vague cloud of the same order as those shown in figures 8 and 14, but in this case the color is yellow instead of crimson or blue. Figure 18. Vague intellectual pleasure. Yellow in any of man's vehicles always indicates intellectual capacity, but its shades vary very much, and it may be complicated by the admixture of other hues. Generally speaking, it has a deeper and duller tint if the intellect is directed chiefly into lower channels, more especially if the objects are selfish. In the astral or mental body of the average man of business, it would show itself as yellow ochre, while pure intellect devoted to the study of philosophy or mathematics appears frequently to be golden, and this rises gradually to a beautiful clear and luminous lemon or primrose yellow when a powerful intellect is being employed absolutely unselfishly for the benefit of humanity. Most yellow thought forms are clearly outlined, and a vague cloud of this color is comparatively rare. It indicates intellectual pleasure, appreciation of the result of ingenuity, or the delight felt in clever workmanship. Such pleasure as the ordinary man derives from the contemplation of a picture usually depends chiefly upon the emotions of admiration, affection, or pity which it arouses within him, or sometimes, if it portrays a scene with which he is familiar, its charm consists in its power to awaken the memory of past joys. An artist, however, may derive from a picture a pleasure of an entirely different character, based upon his recognition of the excellence of the work, and of the ingenuity which has been exercised in producing certain results. Such pure intellectual gratification shows itself in a yellow cloud, and the same effect may be produced by delight in musical ingenuity, or the subtleties of argument. A cloud of this nature betokens the entire absence of any personal emotion, for if that were present it would inevitably tinge the yellow with its own appropriate color. 29. 30. Its kind, for if there were anything base or selfish in the desire, it would inevitably show itself in the darkening of the clear orange hue by dull reds, browns, or grays. If this man coveted place or power, it was not for his own sake, but from the conviction that he could do the work well and truly, and to the advantage of his fellow men. Figure 20. High ambition. Selfish ambition. Ambition of a lower type is represented in Figure 21. Not only have we here a large stain of the dull brown-gray of selfishness, but there is also a considerable difference in the form, though it appears to possess equal definiteness of outline. Figure 20 is rising steadily onward towards a definite object, for it will be observed that the central part of it is as definitely a projectile as Figure 10. Figure 21, on the other hand, is a floating form, and is strongly indicative of general acquisitiveness, the ambition to grasp for the self everything that is within sight. Figure 21. Selfish ambition. 31. Murderous rage and sustained anger. In Figures 22 and 23 we have two terrible examples of the awful effect of anger. The lurid flash from dark clouds, Figure 22, was taken from the aura of a rough and partially intoxicated man in the East End of London. As he struck down a woman, the flash darted out at her the moment before he raised his hand to strike, and caused a shuddering feeling of horror, as though it might slay. Figure 23. Sustained anger and Figure 22. Murderous rage. The keen-pointed stiletto-like dart, Figure 23, was a thought of steady anger, intense and desiring vengeance, of the quality of murder, sustained through years, and directed against a person who had inflicted a deep injury on the one who sent it forth. Had the latter been possessed of a strong and trained will, such a thought form would slay, and the one nourishing it is running a very serious danger of becoming a murderer in act as well as in thought in a future incarnation. It will be noted that both of them take the flash-like form, though the upper is irregular in its shape, while the lower represents a steadiness of intention which is far more dangerous. The basis of utter selfishness out of which the upper one springs is very characteristic and instructive. The difference in color between the two is also worthy of note. In the upper one the dirty brown of selfishness is so strongly evident that it stains even the outrush of anger, while in the second case, though no doubt selfishness was at the root of that also, the original thought has been forgotten in the sustained and concentrated wrath. One who studies Plate 13 in Man Visible and Invisible will be able to image 2. 32. 33. 34. Vague sympathy. In figure 18a we have another of the vague clouds, but this time its green color shows us that it is a manifestation of the feeling of sympathy. We may infer from the indistinct character of its outline that it is not a definite and active sympathy, such as would instantly translate itself from thought into deed. It marks rather such a general feeling of commiseration as might come over a man who read an account of a sad accident, or stood at the door of a hospital ward looking in upon the patients. Figure 18a. Vague sympathy. 35. Sudden fright. One of the most pitiful objects in nature is a man or an animal in a condition of abject fear, and an examination of plate 14. In man, visible and invisible shows that under such circumstances the astral body presents no better appearance than the physical. When a man's astral body is thus in a state of frenzied palpitation, its natural tendency is to throw off amorphous explosive fragments, like masses of rock hurled out in blasting, as will be seen in figure 30. But when a person is not terrified but seriously startled, an effect such as that shown in figure 27 is often produced. In one of the photographs taken by Dr. Baraduc of Paris, it was noticed that an eruption of broken circles resulted from sudden annoyance, and this outrush of crescent-shaped forms seems to be of somewhat the same nature, though in this case there are the accompanying lines of matter which even increase the explosive appearance. It is noteworthy that all the crescents to the right hand, which must obviously have been those expelled earliest, show nothing but the livid gray of fear, but a moment later the man is already partially recovering from the shock, and beginning to feel angry that he allowed himself to be startled. This is shown by the fact that the later crescents are lined with scarlet, evidencing the mingling of anger and fear, while the last crescent is pure scarlet, telling us that even already the fright is entirely overcome, and only the annoyance remains. Figure 27. Sudden fright. 36. Selfish greed. Figure 28 gives us an example of selfish greed, a far lower type than figure 21. It will be noted that here there is nothing even so lofty as ambition, and it is also evident from the tinge of muddy green that the person from whom this unpleasant thought is projecting is quite ready to employ deceit in order to obtain her desire. While the ambition of figure 21 was general in its nature, the craving expressed in figure 28 is for a particular object towards which it is reaching out, for it will be understood that this thought form, like that in figure 13, remains attached to the astral body, which must be supposed to be on the left of the picture. Claw-like forms of this nature are very frequently to be seen converging upon a woman who wears a new dress or bonnet, or some specially attractive article of jewelry. The thought form may vary in color according to the precise amount of envy or jealousy which is mingled with the lust for possession, but an approximation to the shape indicated in our illustration will be found in all cases. Not infrequently people gathered in front of a shop window may be seen thus protruding astral cravings through the glass. Figure 28. Selfish greed. Greed for drink. In figure 29 we have another variant of the same passion, perhaps at an even more degraded and animal level. This specimen was taken from the astral body of a man just as he entered at the door of a drinking shop. The expectation of and the keen desire for the liquor which he was about to absorb showed itself in the projection in front of him of this very unpleasant appearance. Once more the hooked protrusions show the craving, while the color and the coarse mottled texture show the low and sensual nature of the appetite. Sexual desires frequently show themselves in an exactly similar manner. Men who give birth to forms such as this are as yet but little removed from the animal. As they rise in the scale of evolution, the place of this form will gradually be taken by something resembling that shown in figure 13, and very slowly, as development advances, that in turn will pass through the stages indicated in figures 9 and 8, until at last all selfishness is cast out, and the desire to have has. 37. 38. At a shipwreck, very serious is the panic which has occasioned the very interesting group of thought forms which are depicted in figure 30. They were seen simultaneously, arranged exactly as represented, though in the midst of indescribable confusion, so their relative positions have been retained, though in explaining them it will be convenient to take them in reverse order. They were called forth by a terrible accident, and they are instructive as showing how differently people are affected by sudden and serious danger. One form shows nothing but an eruption of the livid gray of fear, rising out of a basis of utter selfishness, and unfortunately there were many such as this. The shattered appearance of the thought form shows the violence and completeness of the explosion, which in turn indicates that the whole soul of that person was possessed with blind, frantic terror, and that the overpowering sense of personal danger excluded for the time every higher feeling. Figure 30. At a shipwreck. The second form represents at least an attempt at self-control, and shows the attitude adopted by a person having a certain amount of religious feeling. The thinker is seeking solace in prayer, and endeavoring in this way to overcome her fear. This is indicated by the point of grayish-blue which lifts itself hesitatingly upwards. The color shows, however, that the effort is but partially successful, and we see also from the lower part of the thought form, with its irregular outline and its falling fragments, that there is in reality almost as much fright here as in the other case. But at least this woman has had presence of mind enough to remember that she ought to pray, and is trying to imagine that she is not afraid as she does it, whereas in the other case there was absolutely no thought beyond selfish terror. The one retains still some semblance of humanity, and some possibility of regaining self-control, the other has for the time cast aside all remnants of decency, and is an abject slave to overwhelming emotion. 39. 40. 41. 42. 43. 44. 45. 46. Sympathy and love for all. Hitherto we have been dealing chiefly with forms which are the expression of emotion, or of such thought as is aroused within the mind by external circumstances. We have now to consider some of those caused by thoughts which arise from within, forms generated during meditation, each being the effect produced by a conscious effort on the part of the thinker to form a certain conception, or to put himself into a certain attitude. Naturally, such thoughts are definite, for the man who trains himself in this way learns how to think with clearness and precision, and the development of his power in this direction shows itself in the beauty and regularity of the shapes produced. In this case, we have the result of an endeavor on the part of the thinker to put himself into an attitude of sympathy and love towards all mankind, and thus we have a series of graceful lines of the luminous green of sympathy with the strong roseate glow of affection shining out between them. Figure 37. The lines are still sufficiently broad and wide apart to be easily drawn, but in some of the higher examples of thought forms of this type the lines are so fine and so close that no human hand can represent them as they really are. The outline of this thought form is that of a leaf, yet its shape and the curve of its lines are more suggestive of a certain kind of shell, so that this is another example of the approximation to forms seen in physical nature which we noted in commenting upon Figure 16. Figure 37. Sympathy and love for all. An aspiration to enfold all. In Figure 38 we have a far more developed example of the same type. Figure 38. An aspiration to enfold all. 47. 48. 49. 50. 51. 52. 53. 54. 55. Helpful thoughts. The figures numbered 48 to 54 were the results of a systematic attempt to send helpful thought by the friend who has furnished us with the sketches. A definite time was given each day at a fixed hour. Figure 48. Helpful thoughts. The forms were in some cases seen by the transmitter, but in all cases were perceived by the recipient, who immediately sent rough sketches of what was seen by the next post to the transmitter, who has kindly supplied the following notes with regard to them. In the colored drawings appended, the blue features appear to have represented the more devotional element of the thought. Figure 49. Helpful thoughts. 56. 57, 58, 59, 60. Forms built by music. Before closing this little treatise, it will perhaps be of interest to our readers to give a few examples of another type of forms unknown to those who are confined to the physical senses as their means of obtaining information. Many people are aware that sound is always associated with color, that when, for example, a musical note is sounded, a flash of color corresponding to it may be seen by those whose finer senses are already to some extent developed. It seems not to be so generally known that sound produces form as well as color, and that every piece of music leaves behind it an impression of this nature, which persists for some considerable time, and is clearly visible and intelligible to those who have eyes to see. Such a shape is perhaps not technically a thought form, unless indeed we take it, as we well may, as the result of the thought of the composer expressed by means of the skill of the musician through his instrument. Some such forms are very striking and impressive, and naturally their variety is infinite. Each class of music has its own type of form, and the style of the composer shows as clearly in the form which his music builds as a man's character shows in his handwriting. Other possibilities of variation are introduced by the kind of instrument upon which the music is performed, and also by the merits of the player. The same piece of music, if accurately played, will always build the same form, but that form will be enormously larger when it is played upon a church organ or by a military band than when it is performed upon a piano. And not only the size, but also the texture of the resultant form will be very different. There will also be a similar difference in texture between the result of a piece of music played upon a violin and the same piece executed upon the flute. Again, the excellence of the performance has its effect, and there is a wonderful difference between the radiant beauty of the form produced by the work of a true artist, perfect alike in expression and execution, and the comparatively dull and undistinguished-looking one which represents the effort of the wooden and mechanical player. Anything like inaccuracy in rendering naturally leaves a corresponding defect in the form, so that the exact character of the performance shows itself just as clearly to the clairvoyant spectator as it does to the auditor. It is obvious that, if time and capacity permitted, hundreds of volumes might be filled with drawings of the forms built by different pieces of music under different conditions, so that the most that can be done within any reasonable compass is to give a few examples of the leading types. It has been decided for the purposes of this book to limit these to three, to take types of music presenting readily recognizable contrasts, and for the sake of simplicity in comparison to present them all as they appeared when played upon the same instrument, a very fine church organ. In each of our plates the church shows as well as the thought form which towers far into the air above it, and it should be remembered that though the drawings are on very different scales, the church is the same in all three cases, and consequently the relative size of the sound form can easily be calculated. The actual height of the tower of the church is just under 100 feet, so it will be seen that the sound form produced by a powerful organ is enormous in size. Such forms remain as coherent erections for some considerable time, an hour or two at least, and during all that time they are radiating forth their characteristic vibrations in every direction, just as our thought forms do, and if the music be good, the effect of those vibrations cannot but be uplifting to every man upon whose vehicles they play. Thus the community owes a very real debt of gratitude to the musician who pours forth such helpful 61, 62, 63, 64, 65. Naturally, every sound makes its impression upon astral and mental matter, not only those ordered successions of sounds which we call music. Some day, perhaps, the forms built by those other less euphonious sounds may be pictured for us, though they are beyond the scope of this treatise. Meantime, those who feel an interest in them may read an account of them in the little book on the hidden side of things. 3F4. 4 by C.W. Leadbeater. 66. I'm Julie, the woman who runs Global Gray. If you downloaded it for free, please consider, if you haven't already, making a small donation.